The canyon smelled like iron and old rain. Reed noticed it the moment he stepped off the ridge path and into the eastern gorge of Veritha's lower shelf. The air down here was heavier than it was at the outpost. It pressed against his skin like something that did not want him there. The stone walls on either side were tall and pale orange, carved by wind over thousands of years into shapes that looked almost like faces if you stared long enough. He did not stare. He had work to do. He had arrived on Verith 3 days ago on a contracted research transport, the only human aboard. The Solnari crew had not been rude. They had simply not spoken to him much, which Reed did not mind. He was used to that. He had been the only human in most rooms for the last 6 years of his career, ever since he signed on as a xenobiological field researcher with the Inter-System Survey Commission. The commission sent him to places other researchers did not want to go. He cataloged things other researchers did not think were worth cataloging. He fixed broken equipment in the field because no one else knew how. He was very good at his job, and almost no one knew his name. The Solnari outpost on Verith was small. For researchers, 2 support staff, and a lead scientist named Davin, who had been studying Veric migration patterns for 11 years. Davin was tall even by Solnari standards, with the flat gray skin and wide-set eyes of his kind, and he had looked at Reed the way most Solnari looked at humans, not with hostility, but with a kind of patient tolerance, the way a person might look at a child who keeps asking questions during a serious meeting. "You will be assigned the Eastern and Southern Survey grids," Davin had told him on the first day. "Standard fauna documentation. Do not approach any Veric you encounter. Do not attempt to interact. Observe and record at a distance of no less than 200 meters. Is that clear?" Reed had said yes. He had meant it at the time. The eastern grid was mostly empty. He spent his first 2 days walking the ridge paths, recording soil samples, photographing 3 species of ground-dwelling creatures that looked like armored beetles the size of dogs, and noting the locations of crystal formations that grew out of the canyon walls in thin vertical sheets. Verith was a mineral-rich world. Almost everything here had something crystalline about it: the rock, the plants, even the Veric themselves, whose bones and wing structures were part biological and part mineral lattice, grown slowly over decades like living stone. On the 3rd day, Reed went deeper into the canyon than his assigned grid technically required. He was not trying to find trouble. He had simply noticed an unusual thermal signature on his scanner, a large heat source, stationary, settled low against the canyon floor about a kilometer past the eastern boundary marker. It could have been a geothermal vent. It could have been a rock formation absorbing the day's amber sunlight and radiating it back. He went to look because looking at things was his job, and because he was curious, and because curiosity had always been the one trait in him that no amount of professional discouragement had ever managed to kill. He came around a wide bend in the canyon and stopped. She was enormous. He had seen photographs of Veric before. He had read the survey reports, studied the biological summaries, looked at the scale diagrams that showed a grown Veric next to a standard transport ship. He thought he had understood what enormous meant. He had not. Standing here, with the real thing 20 meters ahead of him and no scale diagram to soften it, he understood that he had not understood at all. She was lying on her side against the canyon wall, her massive body pressed to the stone like she had been there a long time and had stopped minding. Her scales were white. Not pale white, the way fresh snow is white, the way blank paper is white, a complete and total absence of color that made her look almost like she was carved from the same pale stone as the canyon itself. The Veric in every photograph he had seen were dark-colored. Deep blue, black-green, sometimes a dark amber that matched the sky. This one was white all the way through, even the crystal structures visible along her folded wings, which were the color of old milk glass. Her wings were wrong. Even from 20 meters, Reed could see that. The way they lay against her body was not the resting fold he had seen in the survey images. The crystal rib structures that ran along the wing surface were supposed to lie in even rows, interlocking at their tips like the teeth of 2 gears pressing together. These did not. They jutted at odd angles. Some had broken entirely and lay at the wrong slope against the membrane. The wing surface itself had the look of something that had been crumpled and never fully smoothed back out. She turned her head and looked at him. Reed did not run. He was not particularly brave. He simply understood, in a practical way, that running from something this large was pointless. If she wanted to move quickly, she would. He would not. So he stood where he was, held his scanner loosely at his side, and looked back at her. Her eyes were a pale gold, almost colorless in the canyon light. They were large and old-looking, and they moved over him slowly, taking him in the way a person might look at something they had never seen before and were not sure what to make of. Reed sat down on a flat rock. He opened his pack and took out the food container he had brought for lunch. He ate slowly, keeping his movements small and unhurried. She watched him the whole time. He watched her back. After about 20 minutes, she put her head down on her forelimb, still watching him, but no longer with that tight, assessing stillness. She settled. He noticed the way she moved when she settled. There was a pull to it, a stiffness around the shoulder where the wing attached to the body, a flinch she did not quite manage to hide. She was in pain. Not acute pain, not the kind that made a creature cry out or thrash. The quiet, constant kind. The kind a body learns to work around until working around it becomes the only way of moving it knows. He packed up his lunch. He sat for another 10 minutes, not moving, letting her get used to the idea of him being there. Then he stood slowly, picked up his pack, and walked back the way he had come. At the outpost that evening, he found Davin reviewing migration data at the main console. "There is a white Veric in the eastern canyon," Reed said. "About a kilometer past the boundary marker." Davin did not look up. "That is Sova. She is a known subject. Albino. Born here, in this canyon, approximately 12 years ago. She is not part of the active study. She cannot fly." Davin said it the way you would say the sky is orange, a simple fact, requiring no further thought. "Veric that cannot fly do not migrate. My study is on migration. She is not relevant. Has anyone studied her wings?" Davin looked up at him then. "No. Is there any research on Veric wing repair, regrowth, structural recovery after fracture?" Davin set down his instrument. "Reed," he said, carefully. "The Solnari have observed the Veric for 400 years. A Veric that cannot fly does not recover flight. It is not something that happens. She is what she is. She will remain what she is until she does not remain anything at all." He picked up his instrument again. "She is not worth your time." Reed nodded. He said nothing. He went to his bunk and opened his field tablet and searched every academic database on the survey network for published research on Veric wing anatomy. He found 9 papers. 3 of them were the same paper reprinted in different journals. Of the 6 remaining, only 2 dealt with wing structure in any detail, and both were written more than 80 years ago by a Solnari naturalist who had died before completing the work. He read them twice. Then he started writing his own notes. Nobody had studied her because nobody believed there was anything to find. That was something Reed understood in a deep and familiar way. He had spent his entire career being handed the assignments that others had set down, the problems that others had looked at and walked away from, the questions that others had decided were not worth asking. He had never once walked away from one. He turned off the light and lay on his bunk in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way those wing ribs lay against each other at all the wrong angles. He had seen that pattern before, not in biology. In the broken support struts of a survey crawler he had repaired on a rock moon 3 years ago, after the frame had shattered in a compression event. The pieces had not looked like they could ever fit back together. He had made them fit. He fell asleep thinking about that. Outside, somewhere in the eastern canyon, Sova breathed in and breathed out against the stone, and the amber night settled over Verith like it always did, and the shattered crystal ribs of her wings caught what little light came down between the canyon walls and held it, still and cold and patient. The first time Reed brought food for Sova, she did not eat it. He left it on a flat stone about 10 meters from where she lay and stepped back. She looked at the pile of dried protein compounds and ground fiber bricks, standard Xenofauna dietary supplement, cleared for use with large crystalline biological species, and then she looked at Reed with her pale gold eyes, and then she looked at the canyon wall. The food sat there until he left. When he came back the next day it was gone, though he could not be certain she had eaten it or simply that the wind had moved it. He came back every day. That was the whole plan. Show up. Be quiet. Be small. Be predictable. Give her something to eat. Sit at a respectful distance and do his work. His work, at that point, was documentation. He had a scanner, a handheld imaging unit, a notebook, and the patience that comes from years of being told to wait. He started from the outside of her body and worked inward, recording everything he could observe without approaching closer than 15 meters. The color of her scales, the movement of her breathing, the way she positioned herself through the day as the light shifted, the way she moved when she stood, which was rarely, and always with that same pulled-back stiffness around both shoulders. The way she did not open her wings, not even slightly, not even to shift them. On the 6th day, she let him come to 12 meters. On the 9th day, she was eating the food while he watched. On the 14th day, she was asleep when he arrived, and he sat down cross-legged 3 meters closer than he normally would have and worked quietly on his notes while her massive ribcage rose and fell beside him like a breathing hillside. She woke while he was there and looked at him without alarm, and he looked back at her without alarm, and that was how 12 meters became 8. By the end of the 3rd week, Reed had filled 2 notebooks with observations and produced more detailed documentation of a single Veric than the entire published body of Sulnari research contained. The wing damage, seen close, was extensive. The Veric wing was not like a bird wing or a bat wing. It was closer to an architectural structure, a series of crystal ribs growing out from the shoulder and back spine, each rib a meter or more long, tapering from a thick base to a fine crystalline point. Between the ribs, a membrane of biological tissue stretched tight, thin enough to let amber light through when a Veric flew, thick enough to catch the air. The ribs were not solid. They were latticed hollow inside, built in an interlocking structure that, in a healthy Veric, was extraordinarily strong. The crystal grew throughout a Veric's life, knitting and re-knitting as the animal aged, reinforcing the most used sections, trimming away weak growth. In Sova, something had gone wrong with that process early. Her ribs had fractured during growth, possibly in the rockslide Davin had mentioned, possibly before. The fracture points had not reknit. Instead, the crystal had tried to grow around the breaks, building up uneven deposits at the shatter points that looked, under Reed's scanner, like scar tissue, hard and dense and wrong. Some ribs had shattered entirely and had never reconnected. They lay in their wrong positions, held loosely by the membrane tissue, producing that crumpled, collapsed look he had seen from 20 meters on the first day. She could not fly because the ribs could not bear the load. The membrane had no proper frame to stretch across. If she tried to extend her wings fully, the lateral pressure would snap the already compromised ribs like dry branches. She had never tried. She had learned, somehow, long before she could have understood the physics of it, that the wings were not to be used. She held them in their permanent half-fold like someone holding very still, so a wound would not open. Reed sat with his back to the canyon wall on a Thursday afternoon. He still counted days in human terms, a habit he could not break, and thought about what he was looking at. A biological trap. That was the cleanest way to describe it. The crystal ribs needed to move in order to heal. The resonance of wing movement, the vibration produced by a Veric in flight, was what stimulated the crystal to keep growing, to keep re-knitting, to keep finding the cracks and filling them. That was how healthy Veric maintained their wings across a lifespan that could exceed 2 centuries. The motion was the medicine. Without motion, there was no medicine. Without medicine, there could be no motion. A circle with no opening. He called Oren that night. Oren was a materials engineer based on the survey station 2 systems over. He was 63 years old, had a voice like gravel poured into a metal drum, and had been one of Reed's professors at the Commission's Training Institute 15 years ago. He was possibly the only person in Reed's life who had never once suggested that Reed was wasting his time on something. Biological crystal lattice, Oren said, after Reed had explained everything. Living mineral structure that responds to vibrational stimulus. You want to replicate that stimulus artificially. Yes. A pause. That is either very interesting or completely impossible. Those are usually the same thing. How big are the fracture points? Reed read him the measurements from his scanner. Another pause, longer. Reed could hear Oren breathing the way he breathed when he was thinking, slow and deliberate, like each breath was being used to power something. Send me everything, Oren said finally. All your scans. All your notes. I want to look at the crystal composition data. I can get you more detailed composition scans if she lets me get closer. Get closer then. A pause. Does she bite? Not yet. Comforting. Send me what you have. The next morning, Davin stopped Reed in the outpost corridor before Reed had finished his first cup of water. "You are going to the canyon again," Davin said. "Yes. I have reviewed your daily logs. You have been visiting the Sova subject every day for 22 days. You have not completed your assigned Eastern Grid documentation. I've completed about 80% of it. I'll finish the rest. I'm using my off hours. Your scanner is commission equipment. I'll log the power usage as personal and reimburse it." Davin looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that nothing you do will change what she is." Reed considered that. "I'm not sure I agree with how you've defined what she is," he said. He said it without heat. He said it the way he might note that a measurement was slightly off, factual, corrective, not aggressive. Davin blinked once and said nothing further, and Reed took his pack and his scanner and went to the canyon. She was already looking at him when he came around the bend. She had started doing that, orienting toward the direction he came from before he was visible, as if she could hear his particular footsteps, or smell him, or simply had developed a sense of when he was due. He walked to his usual sitting spot, set down his pack, and took out the food container. She stood, which she rarely did before he had settled. She moved toward him, not rushing, just walking, slow and heavy, each step careful around the ache in her shoulders. She stopped 4 meters away. That was the closest she had ever been while he was on foot. He held still. He held his breath without meaning to. She sniffed at the food container. Then she sat back on her haunches and watched him open it, and she ate from his hands for the first time, her enormous jaw incredibly careful, her breath warm and mineral-smelling against his fingers. He did not move for a while after that, just sat there with the empty container in his hands. Later, when she had settled again and was drowsing in the afternoon heat, he brought out his scanner and began a detailed composition analysis of the crystal rib nearest to him. She let him work. After a while, she shifted her wings slightly, just a few centimeters of adjustment, and the rib he was trying to scan moved into better alignment with his instrument. He stared at that. He looked at her. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was slow and even. He went back to the scan. Near the end of the day, he reached out and pressed his hand flat against the surface of the broken rib closest to him. The crystal was cool and rough under his palm. He could feel the fracture line running diagonally across the rib's surface, hairline on the outside, and deep as a canyon of its own on the inside. He had fixed worse. He told himself that, with his hand on her broken wing in the amber afternoon light of Veric, and it was almost entirely true. The first rig broke in 4 minutes. Reed had spent 9 days designing it, 3 nights building it from stripped survey equipment parts, and 1 full morning carefully fitting it around the base of Sova's lowest wing rib while she sat completely still and watched him with those pale gold eyes. The rig was a frame of lightweight alloy rods, fitted with 6 small vibration emitters spaced along the rib's length, each one calibrated to produce a frequency that Reed and Oren had calculated should match the natural resonance of healthy Veric wing crystal. The idea was simple. The crystal needed vibration to heal. Reed would give it vibration. The rig fired for 4 minutes, hummed very loudly, and then the central emitter housing cracked from the stress of its own output, and the whole thing went dark. Sova looked at the broken rig. She looked at Reed. She made a low sound in her chest that he had started to think of as her version of a sigh. He wrote the failure in his notebook. He took the rig apart, figured out what had failed and why, and started building the second version. The second rig lasted 11 minutes before the frequency coupling between emitters 3 and 4 fell out of sync, and the resulting interference pattern cracked one of Sova's secondary ribs slightly further than it had already been cracked. Reed turned it off immediately, sat very still for a moment, then apologized to her out loud, even though he was aware she could not understand the words. She had flinched when the crack happened. It was a small flinch, barely visible, the kind a large animal makes when it has learned not to show pain too openly. It made Reed feel terrible in a way that no equipment failure ever had. He wrote that failure down too. He was very specific about it. Oren's responses came in with a communication delay of about 4 hours each way, which meant every question took most of a day to answer. Reed had learned to send all his questions in one message and to spend the waiting time building things. The waiting did not bother him. He was good at waiting. What bothered him was the possibility that the answer, when it came, would be that there was no answer. But Oren did not say that. Oren said the frequency coupling problem was a calibration issue and sent him a corrected equation. He said the housing crack was a material stress problem and told Reed exactly which components from the survey supply inventory could be repurposed to handle the load. He said the interference pattern that had hurt Sova was preventable if the emitters were staggered in their firing sequence rather than firing simultaneously. Reed built the third rig. It lasted 22 minutes before the power cell drained faster than expected and everything simply stopped. He built the fourth. A mounting bracket failed. He built the fifth. This one actually ran for 40 minutes and produced measurable output before a membrane contact sensor gave a false reading and Reed shut it down as a precaution. He built the sixth. An emitter cracked under thermal stress from Verith's afternoon heat. Through all of this, Sova watched. She had stopped retreating when he brought the equipment out. In the early days of the rig attempts, she had been wary of the machinery, the sounds it made, the unfamiliar smell of warm metal and circuitry. She did not like sudden loud noises. Reed had learned this fast and made sure every rig failure happened at low output so the sound stayed manageable. He always warned her before he powered anything on, speaking in a low, steady voice, telling her what he was about to do. She could not understand him. He told her anyway. What he had not expected was what she started doing around week 4. He had noticed on the third rig attempt that she had shifted her wing position slightly between the second and third emitter placements, and that the shift had actually improved his mounting angle. He had thought it was coincidence. By the fifth rig, he was not thinking that anymore. She was adjusting. She was watching where he placed each component and angling the wing to make the placement easier. When he moved to a difficult section, she would hold very still in a way that was clearly deliberate, a controlled stillness, not the passive stillness of an animal simply resting. He did not know whether it was intelligence or some deep instinct he did not have a framework for. He thought about it for 2 days and then decided it did not matter. Whatever it was, she was helping him. He started telling her in advance which rib section he was moving to next, pointing at it first, watching her adjust. She was better at the adjustment than he was at predicting when he would need it. Davin came to the canyon on a Tuesday morning with a junior researcher named Fell who carried a recording instrument and said nothing the entire visit. Davin stood at the canyon entrance and watched Reed work for about 30 minutes. Reed was fitting the 6th rig's emitter array along Sova's middle left rib section. Sova had her head turned slightly away from Davin, which Reed had noticed she tended to do with Solnari, a kind of deliberate non-acknowledgement. With Reed, she always faced toward him. She tolerates your presence, Davin said, from the entrance. We've been working together for about 7 weeks, Reed said, without looking up. A silence. No Veric has maintained consistent non-aggressive contact with a researcher for that duration, in any recorded study. I know. Another silence. What is the current status of the repair attempt? 6 failures. Working on the 7th design. Davin said nothing for a moment. Reed could hear him breathing, the particular Solnari breath pattern that indicated they were recalibrating something in their thinking. I see, Davin said finally. And then he left, taking Fell and the recording instrument with him, without saying anything further. Reed did not know what to make of that, so he set it aside and went back to the rib he was working on. The 7th rig took him 4 days to build. Oren had redesigned the emitter housing from scratch, using a thermal buffer system that he had originally developed for deep core mineral analysis equipment. The firing sequence was staggered across all 8 emitters in a rolling pattern that distributed the resonance load evenly across the rib length. The power system had 2 backup cells. The mounting brackets were reinforced with a webbing of braided survey cable. Reed fitted it to Sova on a Thursday morning. She adjusted her wing into position without being asked, holding the rib at an angle that gave him perfect access to all 8 emitter points. He powered it on. It ran. It kept running. He sat back on his heels and watched the emitters cycle through their sequence, one after another, each one producing a pulse of vibration that traveled through the crystal rib and made the whole structure hum at a frequency just below what human ears could properly hear, but that Reed could feel in his back teeth. Sova was very still. Not the tense stillness of discomfort, the open, settled stillness of an animal that was not in pain. 30 minutes. An hour. 2 hours. At the fracture 0.6 centimeters from the base, Where the crystal had cracked diagonally almost through the full width of the rib, he found a hairline of new crystal growth crossing the gap. Less than a millimeter. Barely visible even under the scanner. But it was there. New material. The fracture was beginning to close. One rib. Out of 47 shattered once. One, barely, after 11 weeks. He sat down on the canyon floor. He put his face in both hands. Not crying. Just sitting. Just being very still for a while in the amber afternoon with the sound of the rig humming behind him and Sova's slow breathing filling the canyon around him like weather. His communicator buzzed. Oren, did it work? Reed lifted his head. He looked at the scanner readout still glowing in his other hand. One hairline. One rib. 11 weeks. A little, he said. A little bit of it worked. A long pause on Oren's end. Then, very quietly, in a voice that did not sound like gravel at all. Good. That is enough for today. Send me the data and get some sleep. Reed closed the communicator. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote the number 1 at the top of it. And under that he wrote the date. And under that he wrote a single sentence describing what the scanner had shown. Then he set the notebook down and looked at Sova, who was still holding her wing in position, still and patient, the rig still running its soft rolling pulse against her crystal rib. He picked up his tools and went back to work. There were 46 ribs left. Word travels fast in a small outpost. There were only 6 people at the Veric research station besides Reed, and within 2 days of Davin's visit to the canyon, all 6 of them had opinions about what Reed was doing. He heard the opinions secondhand, through the thin walls of the outpost's common room, through the way conversation stopped when he walked in to collect his food ration. The opinions ranged from amused to irritated to something closer to unsettled, which Reed found more interesting than either of the others. He did not argue with any of them. He had learned a long time ago that arguing about a thing you were still in the middle of proving was a waste of time that could be spent proving it. What he did not anticipate was how quickly the word would travel beyond the outpost. The Solnari academic network on Veric was small but well connected. Davin had apparently filed an observation note, clinical, neutral, carefully worded about a human researcher's ongoing contact with the Sova subject. That note had been read by someone who sent it to someone else, who had mentioned it at a research meeting somewhere in the northern settlement. And 3 weeks later Reed received a formal communication from a name he did not recognize, requesting a meeting at the outpost to discuss concerns about unauthorized interaction with a protected Veric subject. The name was Maru. Elder Researcher, Cultural and Biological Ethics Board, Solnari Northern Authority. He arrived on a clear amber morning when the canyon was at its most beautiful, the light falling long and gold through the ridge gaps, and turning the pale stone to something that looked almost warm. He was very tall, older than Davin, his gray skin carrying the darker undertone that Reed had come to understand indicated advanced age in Solnari. He wore formal robes in the deep blue that the ethics board used. And he carried himself the way people carry themselves when they are used to being the most important presence in a room. He had brought 2 assistants. He had not brought curiosity. His mind, Reed could see immediately, was already made up. Davin brought them to the outpost meeting room. Reed sat across the narrow table from Maru and waited. Maru spoke for a long time. He spoke about the Veric as sacred beings, which they were, by Solnari cultural definition, living relics of the planet's deep biological history, to be observed and respected but never interfered with. He spoke about the principle of natural order, which held that the condition of any living thing was a product of forces older and wiser than any single researcher's judgment. He spoke about the Sova subject specifically, and her albinism, which in Solnari cultural understanding was not a disorder, but a state, a particular kind of existence that the natural world had produced for its own reasons. He spoke about the long history of Solnari research, 400 years of careful observation without intervention. He spoke about what it meant to cross that line. Reed listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When Maru finished, Reed opened his field bag and placed his scanner on the table and turned it to face Maru. "This is a scan of Sova's 14th left wing rib," Reed said. "Taken this morning. This lighter area here is new crystal growth across a fracture point that has been unhealed for at least 11 years, based on the density layering. The rib is reknitting. It has been doing so for 6 weeks." Maru looked at the scan. Something moved in his expression, quickly controlled. The intervention is working, Reed said. I am not saying that to argue with you about cultural principles. I am saying it because it is what is happening. I know that. You have been doing so regardless. Yes. Maru looked at him steadily. Why? Reed thought about the question. He gave it the time it deserved. She was in pain, he said. Every day? Constant pain. From wings she cannot use. From bones that never healed correctly. I could see it every time she moved. I could see it in the way she held herself. He paused. I knew how to reduce that pain. So I did. I would do it again. The natural order. She was born in a rockslide zone and injured before she could ever use her wings, Reed said. That is not natural order. That is bad timing. The two are not the same thing. A silence settled over the room. One of Maru's assistants shifted uncomfortably. Davin stood near the door with his arms folded, watching Reed with an expression that Reed could not fully read. Maru said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, less formal, more careful. You are certain of the scan data? Yes. You are certain this is new growth and not artifact? I've run the analysis 4 times with 2 different instruments. I can show you all 4 results. Another silence. Maru looked at the scan for a long time. Then he straightened, and the formal manner came back like a door closing. I will be filing a formal injunction with the Commission. You will be required to cease all contact with the SOVA subject within 30 days. He stood. His assistant stood. He looked at Reed one more time, and Reed saw something in that look that was not hostility. It was something more complicated than that. Something that might have been the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. Then they left. Reed sat at the table after they were gone. Davin remained by the door. 30 days, Davin said. Yes. I know. Davin looked at him. What will you do? Reed stood and picked up his scanner. File the appeal tonight. Go to the canyon tomorrow morning. He put his bag over his shoulder. She's on a good schedule with the 7th rig. I don't want to break the treatment cycle. He was almost at the door when a voice behind him said his name. Quiet, tentative. He turned. Fell the junior researcher who had come with Davin to the canyon weeks ago, and said nothing the whole time, was standing in the corridor entrance. She was young, Reed thought, even by Solnari standards, her gray skin still carrying the lighter tone of someone who had not been in planetary field conditions long. She was holding a data chip between 2 fingers. My name is Leva, she said. Not Fel. Davin introduced me wrong that day. She held the chip out. The Solnari Northern Archive has biological records on Veric crystal composition going back 200 years. They were never shared with Commission researchers. I pulled the most relevant sections. She paused. Your resonance calibrations are close, but the harmonic second frequency is wrong. These records might help you correct it. Reed looked at the chip. He looked at her. You could lose your position, he said, for sharing restricted archive material. Yes, she said simply. He took the chip. Thank you, Leva. She nodded and walked away quickly, back into the outpost interior, and he stood for a moment in the corridor holding the chip before he put it in his bag and went to file his appeal. The next morning, Sova was already facing his direction when he came around the canyon bend. She had started stretching her wings while he was away. He could see it in the mark the extended wing tip had left in the soft canyon dust, a long shallow arc, pressed into the ground. She had tried to open the wing while he was not there. She had not managed more than 30 or 40 centimeters of extension before the pain stopped her. But she had tried. He stood looking at that arc in the dust for a while. Maru had called what he was doing interference. Reed had always called it something simpler. She was in pain. The pain could be reduced. Those were the only 2 facts that had ever mattered to him. He set down his pack and got to work. On the first day of the countdown, Reed drew a small grid in the back of his notebook. 30 boxes. He crossed off the first one and went to the canyon. Leva's archive data changed things considerably. The harmonic second frequency in his resonance calibration had been running at 3.4 cycles off from what the old Solnari records described as the natural resonance baseline of healthy adult Veric crystal. It did not sound like much. In biological crystal structure, it was the difference between a signal the material could absorb and a signal it deflected. Reed had been pushing vibration at Sova's wing ribs for weeks, and a meaningful percentage of every pulse had simply been bouncing off. The ribs had still been healing. The new crystal growth proved that, but far more slowly than they should have been. He corrected the calibration using Leva's numbers. The next morning's scan showed 3 times the crystal deposition rate of any previous session. He called Oren immediately. Oren was quiet for a long time after Reed explained the new numbers. Then he said something Reed had never heard him say before, which was nothing at all, and the silence stretched on long enough that Reed checked his communicator to see if the connection had dropped. Oren. I am doing the math, Oren said. And another pause. If the new rate holds, and if we can maintain consistent daily sessions, and if the remaining ribs respond at roughly the same rate as the ones you have already been treating, he stopped. You might have 60% structural integrity in 30 days. Reed sat with that for a moment. Is 60% enough to fly? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. There is no baseline data for a Veric attempting flight at partial wing integrity. So we don't know if it's enough. No, but I know that 60% is the highest it will ever be if you stop at 30 days. After that it starts declining. Crystal that has reknitted but is not maintained by regular resonance treatment will begin to degrade again within a few months. He paused. You understand what I am saying. Reed understood. 60% on day 30, then decline. Or he could push the attempt before the injunction locked him out, while the healing was at its peak, and find out whether 60% was enough to hold under the stress of actual flight. The attempt could kill her, Reed said, if the ribs crack under load. Yes, Oren said. It could. A pause. Not attempting could also kill her. Slower. Over months. Another pause. I am not going to tell you what to do, Reed. I want to be clear about that. I know. I want to also be clear that if you do attempt it, I want you to let me run one more calibration pass on the rig settings first. I have some ideas about pre-stressing the crystal before the attempt to increase load tolerance. Send me today's skin data. Reed sent it. He sat in the canyon with Sova in the amber afternoon light and thought about what 60% meant. She was stretched out on her side near him, close enough now that he could have touched her without standing up. She had started doing that, positioning herself close when he was working, the way animals do when they have decided something is safe. Her breathing was easier than it had been when he first found her. The constant pain she had lived with for years was not gone, but it was quieter. He could see it in the looseness of her shoulders. He had 9 days to build the launch assist frame. He started that night. The frame was simpler in concept than the resonance rig, but harder to build physically. A set of wide support struts positioned to brace against Sova's shoulders and back at the moment of a wing extension attempt, reducing the lateral stress on the partially healed ribs by transferring some of the load to the frame instead. It would not make flight easy, but it might make it survivable. He worked at night because the days were full of treatment sessions, and he did not want to lose a single one. He slept 4 hours. He ate when he remembered to. He crossed boxes off his notebook grid one by one and kept building. On the 28th day, with 2 days left on the countdown, Leva arrived at the canyon before sunrise. Reed was still working on the final strut attachment when he heard footsteps on the canyon path. He turned, and it was her, carrying a data pad and moving quickly, her breath visible in the cold pre-dawn air. She did not say good morning. She held the data pad out. I ran the pre-stress calibration Oren sent me. His numbers were good, but there was a resonance gap between emitters 2 and 5 that would have caused uneven crystal loading at full extension. I closed it. She turned the pad so he could see the new sequence. This gives you a more even distribution across all 47 ribs simultaneously. The peak load tolerance should be 8 to 12% higher. Reed looked at the numbers. They were clean. Cleaner than Oren's version, which was saying something. How long did this take you, he asked. Since yesterday afternoon. He took the data pad. Leva, you know if this goes wrong today, the ethics board will know you helped. Yes. That does not bother you. She looked at him steadily, her wide Solnari eyes calm. She has been in this canyon for 12 years, she said. Nobody came. You came. She looked at Sova, who was watching both of them from across the canyon floor. I would like to see what happens when someone comes. They set up in silence, working together, Reed on the frame bracing and Leva on the resonance rig calibrations. Sova watched the activity without alarm, turning her head slowly as each component went into position as if following the assembly process. He told her what he was going to try. He told her slowly and clearly, knowing she could not understand the words, because it seemed important to say them anyway. He told her the rig was going to feel different than usual. He told her she did not have to do anything except hold still and trust the frame. He told her that he was sorry it had taken this long. He told her she had been very patient. She lowered her head until her jaw was level with his chest and held it there for a moment. He put his hand on the side of her jaw, briefly. Then she lifted her head again and turned to face the open center of the canyon. He powered the rig on. The new calibration sequence hit immediately clean and even across all 47 ribs at once, the harmonic frequencies building against each other in a rolling wave that Reed could feel through the canyon floor. Sova's body went very still. Her wings, still in their permanent fold, began to tremble. Then they opened. Slowly, a centimeter, 5, 20, half a meter, further, the shattered and healing crystal ribs spreading apart from each other as the membrane between them caught and pulled, and the whole architecture of the wing extended outward for the first time in her life. The sound it made was extraordinary, a deep, resonant hum, felt more than heard, the sound of something very large moving that had never moved before. The frame braces took the load. The ribs held. The crystal caught the morning light and threw it back in 1,000 directions at once, prismatic fragments of amber and white and pale blue scattering across the canyon walls. Both wings, fully open, enormous and white and slightly wrong-shaped from years of being folded wrong, trembling with effort and with something that was perhaps very close to the effort of standing up after a very long time on the ground. She did not fly. She stood with her wings fully spread in the morning light and breathed. Her breathing was loud and deep and not at all afraid. Reed stood 40 feet away and watched her. Davin was at the canyon rim. He had come silently, and Reed had not noticed. Maru was beside him, which Reed also had not noticed. A cluster of Solnari from the outpost and beyond stood along the rim in the morning light, looking down. Nobody spoke. Sova folded her wings, looked at Reed. Then, slowly, deliberately, she spread them open again. "Look what I can do." Reed did not say anything. He opened his notebook and wrote it down. Every detail, the angle, the duration, the sound, the light. He wrote it all down in his careful small handwriting while his hands were not entirely steady. And when he had finished writing, he looked up, and she was still standing there with her wings open under the violet-edged morning sky of Veric, patient as stone, glowing like something that had never been broken at all. The injunction would come in the morning. He had one night left. He sat down on the canyon floor with his back to the stone and watched her breathe with her wings spread under the emerging stars, and he thought, "This is enough. Whatever comes next, this is already enough." The injunction officials arrived at the canyon entrance at 7 in the morning. There were 3 of them. 2 were administrative staff from the commission's regional office, carrying sealed documents and looking mildly uncomfortable with the early hour and the long walk from the transit point. The 3rd was a senior ethics board representative whose name Reed did not catch because she spoke it too quickly and he was not paying close attention. They had come with Davin, who walked slightly behind the group and said nothing. Reed was waiting at the canyon entrance. He had his pack on his back, his notebooks inside it, his scanner at his hip. He had been up since before dawn. He had gone into the canyon at first light and sat with Sova for an hour while Verith's amber sun came up over the eastern ridge, just sitting, not working, just there. She had eaten from his hands. He had scratched the base of the crystal rib nearest her jaw, which she had decided several weeks ago she enjoyed, judging by the way she pressed into it. He had stayed until he heard the transport vehicle on the access road, and then he had walked to the entrance. He was calm. He was ready. He had made his peace with it during the night. The senior representative began speaking about the injunction terms. 30-day restriction on contact pending review. All equipment to be removed from the canyon. A formal record of the unauthorized intervention to be attached to Reed's commission file. She spoke clearly and professionally, and without any particular hostility. Reed was listening. He was also listening to the canyon behind him. There was a sound. It began low and below hearing, more of a pressure than a noise, felt in the chest and the back of the throat. Then it built a deep, resonant hum, enormous and rolling, like the world was clearing its throat. The officials stopped talking. Everyone stopped moving. The sound became a wind. It came out of the canyon in a single massive pulse, a wall of displaced air that hit all of them at once. One of the administrative staff sat down very suddenly on the ground. The ethics board representative grabbed the canyon entrance post with both hands. Documents scattered. Davin planted his feet and held on and stared at the sky above the canyon rim. Sova came out of the canyon. She cleared the rim wall in one stroke of her wings, and the sight of her was simply not something a person could be prepared for regardless of how much warning they had been given. She was white against the amber morning sky, like a tear in the world, like something from a time before the planet had learned to keep things on the ground. Her wingspan was immense. The crystal ribs caught the angle of the sun and threw light in every direction, prismatic and scattered and brilliant, so that she flew surrounded by a halo of fragmented color. The healing was visible in the ribs. You could see the places where the crystal had reknit, the fracture lines now sealed with new growth that was slightly lighter in color than the surrounding material, like scars that had become stronger than the original. She was not graceful. It was a first flight, and it showed. Her strokes were uneven, one wing generating slightly more lift than the other, her body listing and correcting and listing again. She climbed in a wide, irregular spiral rather than a clean arc. Her altitude was inconsistent. None of that mattered in any way that words could adequately describe. She was in the air. She had never been in the air. She had been born into a life that said she would never be in the air, and she was in the air, and she was making a sound that none of them had ever heard of Veric make, not the low chest hum of contentment or the sharp warning call or any of the cataloged vocalizations in 40 years of Solnari research notes. This was something else. Something that had no name in any language any of them spoke, because no one had ever needed a word for it before. Maru was standing at the canyon rim above them. Reed had not seen him arrive. He stood very still with his hands at his sides and his face turned upward, and there were tears running down his gray cheeks in the amber morning light, quiet and unhurried, and he did not seem to know they were there. Leva was recording. She had her full instrument array out and was capturing everything visual, acoustic, atmospheric, crystal resonance frequency, her hands moving quickly and efficiently across the equipment, even though she was also crying, which Reed noticed with a kind of distant warmth. Davin stood with his arms no longer folded and his mouth slightly open. Sova circled for 10 minutes. She was not perfect. She wobbled. She corrected. She wobbled again. She found a thermal rising off the sun-warmed eastern ridge and rode it upward for 2 full circles, gaining altitude with more ease than her uneven stroke had managed. And at the top of those 2 circles, she hung for a moment against the sky, completely still, wings fully spread, the wind doing the work, and from the ground, she looked like something painted against the amber and violet above them, impossible and very real. Then she came down. She landed 30 feet from Reed. The impact of it shook the ground, and the officials grabbed each other, and the dust rose in a wide circle around her, and when it settled, she was standing there, chest heaving from the effort, wings slowly folding back into their resting position, and she looked at Reed. He stood very still. She crossed the 30 feet between them in 4 slow steps, each one careful, her enormous body moving with deliberate gentleness. She stopped with her head directly above him and lowered it, slowly, until her jaw rested lightly on the top of his head. Just resting. Just there. He felt the weight of it, warm and heavy and alive. He heard her breathe. He did not move. After a moment, she lifted her head and stepped back. She looked at him steadily with those pale gold eyes, and then she turned and walked back into the canyon, her wings folding and settling and her footsteps quieting against the stone. Nobody spoke for a while. The ethics board representative was the first to find words. "Should we proceed with the formal documentation?" she said, to no one in particular. Maru stepped down from the canyon rim path to the entrance level. He moved slowly, like a man who had just been shown something that had rearranged the furniture in his mind and was still finding his way around it. He stopped in front of the representative and spoke to her in rapid Solnari, and Reed caught only part of it, but he caught enough. Withdrawal of objection. Insufficient grounds. Pending full review. The representative looked at Maru for a long moment, looked at Reed, looked at the canyon entrance where Sova had disappeared. She tucked the documents back into her case. Reed sat down on a rock. He opened his notebook and wrote the time and the date and the words "first flight," and then the duration, 10 minutes. And then he stopped writing and just held the open notebook in his hands for a while. 3 months later, things were different. Sova flew for 4 hours on a clear morning in what Verith's calendar called late season, riding the ridge thermals in long, easy loops above the eastern canyon, her white wings steady and even now, the healing complete enough that the wobble was mostly gone. She was not perfect. She would never be a typical Veric, whatever that meant. But she was in the air, and she was in the air on her own terms, and she came back to the canyon every time, which the Sulnari researchers who had now descended on Verith in considerable numbers found fascinating and Reed found simply reasonable. Oren had sent 3 increasingly annoyed messages about insufficient citation credit in Leva's preliminary research paper. Leva had sent 3 increasingly patient responses explaining that his name was the second listed on every section he had contributed to, and that second was not the same as absent. Reed had stayed out of it. Davin had not said much, but he had started keeping his own observation notes on Sova's flight patterns, careful and thorough, the kind of notes a researcher keeps when they have decided something is worth studying after all. Reed was sitting in the canyon on a quiet afternoon, writing up the week's treatment logs, when Sova landed nearby with the particular controlled thud she had developed now that she had options about how she came down. She settled on her haunches and watched him write. He did not look up. She did not leave. Someone asked him later, a journalist from one of the Commission's public record services who had heard about the case, what made him think he could repair a Veric's wings when every expert said it was not possible. Reed thought about the question for a moment. He thought about 9 days in a canyon eating lunch across from an animal that everyone had already written off. He thought about 47 broken ribs and 6 failed rigs and 11 weeks to fix the first one. He thought about Leva in the pre-dawn dark with a data pad full of corrected numbers, and Oren's voice going quiet on a communicator the first time the rig worked, and a white dragon standing with her wings open in the morning light, showing him what she could do. I did not think I could, he said. I just thought it was worth trying longer than everyone else was willing to. The journalist wrote that down. Reed went back to his notebook. Above the canyon, the amber sky of Verith was wide and clear and deep, and somewhere up in the warm thermals above the eastern ridge, something white and vast and imperfect and alive was banking slowly left in a long, easy arc, her crystal wings catching the light, scattering it down in pieces across the stone below like the world was made of something that had always been worth fixing.